Well, good afternoon. This is a unusual way to be holding class, but I guess given some of the alternatives, it's probably not the worst. Welcome to my man cave, but it's more comfortable for me in lieu of a classroom, but whatever. I recently sent over in the contents section a brief PowerPoint that is entitled Innovation Overview. Hopefully you've had the chance to go through it. If not, if you can pull that up. Just want to go through some of the slides, not going to go through every single one of them, but part of what you're tasked to do with your groups as far as final deliverables and so forth, obviously is to come up with a product or service. We talked about blue ocean, red ocean, and so forth, so you're going to want to make some kind of a commitment one way or the other. The other thing is that, it's got to be commercially viable, and I know that's a bit of a red herring because, what is commercially viable? And just because the first laptop that came out was $3,000 and then 2 years later it was down to about $700 or maybe close to $1,000, where do we draw these lines? I want to talk a little bit about the climate of innovation, but in the context of an organization. So I've taken a PowerPoint deck because I have not been able to get into the university, and I do hope, by the way, to do some live sessions using Zoom, but we're not at that point today, so I'm still recording and putting things up, providing links. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about this notion of organizations and this climate of innovation and organizational behavior and blah, blah, blah. One of the big conflicts when I talk about global is the conflict between winners and losers. We have this almost utopian perspective, especially at the undergrad level, of what globalization is. And it's all this textbook nicety stuff about how we're all winners and it provides a lower price and everybody, and almost brings tears to your eyes. Well, innovation is not all that much different. Certainly in the context of supply chain, and I'm going to make some of those parallels here. But when we look at innovation and we look at the purpose of the firm, which of course is, the profit motive, I'll keep it simple. Is this a conflict? Are we talking about conflicted purpose here? And we may well be in some areas. So we're concerned in terms of this innovation climate, not just the team aspects, not just the HRM, the human resource aspects and so forth, but we're also, talking about how does this purpose of the firm play into all of this, the commercially viable piece and so forth. So I want to go into a little bit of that. So, when you get to the first slide, it simply says innovation and gives us some kind of a textbook definition. And as I told you, especially at the graduate level, I'm not hugely interested in the undergrad, turn to page 32, innovation is, but that's a little bit about what this slide is. So innovation is simply the process of creating and implementing a new idea or ideas. Now, this particular text and author argues that there are three types of innovation that have been included. One is process innovation, one is technical innovation, and one is administrative innovation. And these all, again, bleed back to the organization. So process innovation, it's argued, is achieved through the creation of a new means of producing, selling, and or distributing an existing product or service. Well, that's almost identical to what we think about in terms of supply chain, because supply chain, and again, I'm not going to get into the designations of Tier 1, Tier 2 suppliers and so forth, that's another course, but we're looking at quite a lot of these things. We're looking at the idea of producing. We're looking at the idea of perhaps even manufacturing. We're certainly looking at the idea of selling and distributing, and all of this with an end user focus, a demand driven focus, but the end user demand perspective. So some examples of this process innovation perspective might be online banking. You know, it's not so new today, but 20 years ago it was newer, certainly. E-commerce, the idea of EDI that I bring up in class frequently, electronic data interchange, that was the big bet that Walmart made. Now it's got to be 40 years ago and so forth. And other elements that have come up over time, just-in-time delivery, MRP, material resource planning, and on and on and on. You know, we can come up with an alphabet soup of acronyms and what those things seem to mean. Technical innovation is simply the creation of a new product or service. If we accept that definition rather than creating our own, which was my point about, you know, undergrads and textbook and all of this stuff. So if we're going to come up with a definition of innovation, it probably for us surrounds the notion of technical innovation, and certainly our end user products or final deliverables are going to revolve around this. It's simply the creation of a new product or service. Now, of course, that's pretty abstract. What does that mean? But some examples that we might consider, and again, are we going to insist that it's disruptive versus sustaining? Well, then we'd have to draw those lines as well. Commercially viable, we'd have to draw that line. But some examples, a new line of battery automobiles, Tesla. You know, now, we can make arguments probably both ways. Is it sustaining innovation? Is it really disruptive innovation? So on and so forth. But if we were to do something like that, certainly for our final deliverable, I think it more than meets the requirement. Another one would be the introduction of cellular telephones, and there are many iterations and gimmicks, in quotes, that have been attached to cell phones, and I think I referred to you know, my childhood friend Bob Epsom, who is now retired and living in Key Largo. He's got like 13 patents to his name, and a lot of those are he and several other engineers that worked as a group and so forth. But the point being, you know, very smart guy, and had an awful lot to do with Motorola and the cellular phone industry and so forth, but that's another story. Administrative innovation. Well, administrative innovation is the creation of new organizational design, okay, something which better supports the creation, production, and delivery of services or products. Well, here again, this parallels our whole supply chain argument as well. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make by stating these, you know, parallelisms, if you will, is that, you know, all this new stuff we seem to be sucked into, supply chain, global supply chain, innovation, global innovation, managing supply chain, global strategic, you know, all these things have some very common and underlying themes to all of them. So, I mean, that's a parallel I am trying to create. So, an example that at least this author argues in terms of administrative innovation is the notion of virtual teams. Now, that's, not to put too fine a point on it, that's what you guys are. In essence, you're virtual teams. Any task-focused group, that's you, that meets without all members being in the same room or even working at the same time. Well, there you go. That's a virtual team, and that's what we're doing. That's how we're going to finish the semester as well. Then we go on here a little bit about learning organizations, and I don't want to highlight too much here other than a learning organization arguably involves all of the employees or the members in the process of identifying and solving problems. That enables arguably an organization to continuously experiment, to continuously improve, to continuously increase its capacity to deliver to its customers new and improved products, services, blah, blah, blah. Learning organization through continuous innovation and change creates its own brand of sustainable competitive advantage, and that gives us a little perspective and brings in a little bit of, Michael Porter there as well. You've gotten to this slide, characteristics of a learning organization. I'm going to sidestep through a lot of this because that's not the purpose of what I was trying to do today. The next slide gives you the perspective, 5 building blocks of a learning organization. and it speaks to the idea of shared leadership as being one thing, and it talks to that. Basically a sharing of decision making and a sharing of leadership roles and capacities and so forth, and where that might lead. Talks to culture. Learning organization encourages and empowers arguably employees to identify and experiment with new methods and approaches. Empowerment provides a way to integrate tasks and allows the employees to buy into an organization's goals, and that's an important perspective. Then it talks about strategy, and again, this is similar to supply chain because it addresses three key issues: a customer focus, which reflects a clear understanding of how important customers are, to our overall success. Long-term perspectives, process of learning and change, and it simply just takes time sometimes. Internal alignment, the business strategy drives the design of all systems within the organization, and that's not always the case. I mean, that's certainly aspirational. Goes on to talk about organizational design in a learning organization. This emphasizes the use of teams and strategic alliances. Well, that's pretty much the supply chain. Back in the day, another one of those back in the day stories, but back in the day when I was doing factory automation and robotics, and this is water. Now watch, I'm going to drop my laptop, see how coordinated I'm not here, but yesterday I had hot coffee for the things I was doing. Should have been scotch. Apologize for being rude and drinking in front of you.